Ukrainian commanders are mad at the low quality of soldiers they are reportedly receiving from the Ministry of Defense. Just how are they coping with this? And what happens to a military when so many soldiers are undertrained? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is actually a story from the Washington Post. Because I don't want to give the Washington Post money, I found another copy and paste of this article. God bless it. This is the sketchiest website on earth, but it seems like it is the accurate article. And the overall story is that Ukraine, you may remember, has expanded its conscription policy, conscripting more soldiers and slightly younger soldiers, younger being like 25. Don't get all up in a tiz. But in addition to some other reforms allowing individuals with nonviolent offenses to serve in the military, the Ukrainian troops are running into a different bottleneck. While they have more people, Ukraine has to figure out how to turn those civilian conscripts into soldiers, right? And this is actually way worse than you might even think, right? According to one commander with the 93rd Mech, he says some of their soldiers don't even know how to disassemble and assemble their weapon. If you've served in the military, you know that that skill is essential for making sure your weapon is functioning and clean, right? If you can't do that, your weapon breaks. I don't know. What do? Hand it to your NCO and go, sir, my weapon broke. Right? It's a pretty rudimentary and fundamental soldier skill, right? There also is reports that some of these soldiers are firing as little as just a 20 rounds in basic training. They interviewed one soldier who says, quote, that he's making sure everyone fires at least one box of bullets a day, which they report is 1,500 rounds. That's a massive number of rounds. It would be challenging to fire that in a day. What you might say, they might mean 21 like box of rounds, which is about 20 rounds. That if you fired that every single day, after a couple weeks, you would actually get pretty proficient with your weapon. And some of these soldiers are not coming just from the basic training, right? Again, this Ukrainian officer says we're wasting time in basic training. He says, God forbid, if there was a breakthrough near Chasiv Yar, we would have infantry who don't know the basics. They would be sent there, he says, just to die, right? And some of these stories are kind of preposterous, right? While some frontline commanders say, listen, we'll take anybody who shows up, he says many of these soldiers arrive ill-prepared, right? And he said actually many of them are not new conscripts. Many of them have served in the military since the Russian invasion began. They profiled one Ukrainian soldier named Val, whose job had been as a guard on a bridge in southern Odessa, right? This is a job he's done every day since enlisting at the start of the invasion. And then he was told on April 30th he was transferred to combat duty and within 24 hours assigned to the 93rd Brigade. He said, quote, it's scary and nobody was really prepared, but that is actually pretty good because here's a soldier who completed some level of training and while standing guard on a bridge is a far cry from combat duty, at least Val is in shape, motivated, and committed to the defense of Ukraine, right? But you get a lot of even worse quality soldiers, right? For example, they profile a reconnaissance unit, right? Reconnaissance is a very complex and difficult job, right? And many of the scouts in this reconnaissance unit had just been transferred from rear assignments like our bridge guard and were given 2 weeks of preparation before they were sent into battle, right? And if you've ever done reconnaissance work, you know that it's very technical and very, very difficult, particularly because some of those roles required you to bypass Russian defenses. Very difficult, right? And while some of the new soldiers say that the Ukrainian training centers teach, quote, complete nonsense, that you learn everything on the spot, this is also kind of true. There's still fundamental soldier skills that do get imparted through training events, right? They point out that, for example, one officer said a training center receives only 20 rounds per soldier. That's almost no time to get familiar with shooting and operating the weapon. He says there's no grenades, no grenade launcher rounds. And that is the problem, is that there's no training system. The officer said that actually Ukraine needs its instructors. It needs to train the trainers. These Ukrainian instructors need to be taught by NATO trainers so that there is a standard 2-month basic training and can be condensed into 1 month. There's a limit to how hard you can condense these sort of things, right? And the current priority for the Ukrainian General Staff is not to train in country where facilities can be targeted by Russian weapons, but to train those soldiers abroad. Britain is, of course, the #1 provider of basic training for Ukrainians to date, though France is considering also sending some trainers. Right. And to make things even more complex, a lot of brigades, as we talked about, are competing with the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, trying to recruit their own soldiers directly. One National Guard brigade is actually offering as an enlistment benefit 60 days of training before being sent to the front line, right? Which is kind of insane. And when you look at what sort of... one of the hardest things that a lot of these brigades talk about is, in the article, they say, listen, there's a wide range of conscripts. There are some conscripts who are motivated, who say, listen, I want to defend Ukraine. I understand I've been drafted, but like the soldiers of the Second World War, I'm going to show up and I'm going to do my job to the best of my ability, right? They're often younger. They're more in shape. Sometimes they're guys who say, listen, I graduated college. I'm going to join. I'm going to do my part. But the problem is that for every one person that's like that, most of the people who were here to defend Ukraine, they signed up to defend Ukraine, right? Now, he says we've got people who are very old, who have medical problems that they didn't disclose or that the Ministry of Defense isn't talking about, like people in their 50s and 60s who have back problems, for example, and struggle to walk with gear on. You have a lot of people who simply say, I don't want to fight. I am not going to fight. I do not care. I will refuse any order to fight. And what can you do? Ukraine can put them in jail, but that's going to be a burden on taxpayers. So a lot of these units say, listen, I want to recruit from my own pools, right? I want to recruit from I want to do my own recruiting so that we can find soldiers who want to be here, right? And that is something we've heard. This isn't new to this surge. But what I want to point out is that, Ukraine aspires to get these soldiers in and out of training in a month, 4 weeks. To give you a perspective, the U.S. Army has at least been piloting a 22-week infantry training school, right? OSIT is one station unit training. So that's your basic training, which is 10 weeks long. Then you have additional job training, which in this case is an additional 12 weeks. So you're looking at, for infantry soldiers, the U.S. Army says, listen, we want you to have 6 months of training before you get to your unit. Now, I know if you're thinking what I'm thinking, you say, listen, what are these units doing? It's peacetime. When these soldiers get to their unit, are they not training? What else are you doing? Why did we train the wartime army did so much training all of the time. How on earth are soldiers arriving at these units and needed 6 additional months of training? But that's not the story here. The real story is that, right, the U.S. Army says, listen, the basics are at least 14 weeks, right? That was the original one, 14-week infantry OSIT. So to sit there and go, listen, it takes 3 months to get a basic infantry private ready to fight. Ukraine says, listen, we got to parse it down. You can parse it down to maybe 10 weeks, maybe get it down to 2 months, but 2.5 months. That's still a pretty tight schedule, right? And so for Ukraine to sit there and go, listen, it should tell you something that units are offering 60 days of training as a perk, as a contrast. I think you're seeing Ukrainian soldiers arrive at the front line with very, very little preparation. I think the fact that people are out here, units are out here advertising 60 days of training That should tell you that the average soldier is getting about 30, so about 4 weeks of training. So less than half of what a basic private in a peacetime army gets. And remember, in Iraq and Afghanistan, like my guys in Afghanistan, I had some people assigned to my unit fresh out of basic training. They literally didn't even go with the unit to the front lines or to the AO. They literally flew in a bird afterward. Like they arrived like a month later, like fresh out of basic training. And obviously they needed, we buddied them up with an experienced soldier to get them up to speed on the unit and how we did things. But here's what I didn't have to worry about. I didn't have to ask myself, does this soldier know how to use their weapon? Right? I didn't have to ask myself, does this soldier know how to wear their gear appropriately? Does this soldier know how to speak over a microphone? Or even worse, I didn't have to worry, does this soldier know how to treat a wounded person? Right? If they see someone who needs a tourniquet or a bandage, do they know what to do? And so the fact is that when you had those basic skills down, it became easy to say, okay, here's the way our unit does things. Here's how you patrol. Here's how you hold, like they knew how to hold their weapons. We got to say, listen, here's our TTPs for patrols, right? We do our vehicle rally point. We use that as kind of our overwatch or our cover position. We have dismounts, kind of range out, right? All that you can do if someone has the requisite skills. It's sort of like saying, listen, let's say you wanted to sing a song in a different language. Well, if the person already speaks fluent Spanish, for example, then it's way easier to sit there and go, okay, I know you're already proficient in English, so here's a song, right? Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, right, for example. Very easy to pick up. If you don't speak the language, it's almost impossible to get those advanced skills quickly, right? It's not impossible, but it's so much longer. So that is kind of the situation that Ukraine is looking. But here's the thing. A lot of times, again, the Washington Post, some of these articles, they don't really understand military affairs. So we're going to talk about why things still aren't as dire as maybe this article makes it seem. But first, of course, if you guys haven't picked up your Strike Gum, you absolutely should, right? 90 milligrams caffeine in every piece, 100 milligrams alpha GPC, 0 sugar, the equivalent of a Red Bull or Amp Energy in each one of these little pieces. Made here in the USA with high quality ingredients, natural caffeine, right? Extracted from coffee beans, none of that weird lab grown encapsulated stuff. And we have a 5-pack. So if you're interested in checking it out, right? You think it's a little over the top to order a single pack of gum. I don't blame you. And you're like, listen, I don't need a whole tray. The 5-pack is that sweet middle ground for you. But again, if you want to try it, check it out. Basically, because this is a made in the USA, this is a premium product. It tastes great, especially relative to the other dehydrated caffeine gums that you can find on Amazon. We don't make any money on these individual packs. I think we lose like a few cents. But people that try it, I know, you guys are going to reorder. And that's the whole point. So again, thanks to everybody that's ordered. Thanks to people that go on Amazon. We also have all this on Amazon. You should absolutely go to Amazon, search Strike Gum, pick some up, and leave a review because, again, that helps tell people, yo, this is the real deal. This is the good stuff, the made in the USA, the 90 milligrams of caffeine in every piece, the real deal. So thank you, guys. Okay, so here's why I think this isn't that big a deal. It seems, at least according to the Ukrainian General Staff, that Russian troops hit record losses in May, Ukraine claims. Ukraine's estimate, which again, Ukraine's going to talk its book a little bit here, but estimates that Russia had around 40,000 casualties, which is interesting because this is the first time we've seen Russian casualties, not the first time, but this is one of the rarer occasions where Russian casualties have exceeded the 30,000 a month that Russia can recruit, right? So the Russian military, if the 30,000 a month estimate remains correct, that means that the Russian military has been attrited at a rate, it has had a net loss, if that makes sense, right? 30,000 in, 38,000 out. Now, losses include casualties. Some of those casualties will recuperate and return to the front line. Some of them will not. But the previous record was nearly 30,000 in December last year. And so you may ask yourself, well, how come Russia is advancing, but it's incurring such massive casualties? Well, the answer is pretty simple, right? And that is because Ukraine has pivoted their strategy, right? This is why the Washington Post is like, Ukraine's losing territory, right? Ukraine is indeed losing some territory. But when you look at the territory every day, as we do on this channel, you guys know that the territory that Russia takes, sometimes it has value, right? Sometimes it has a military value. You can see here, the only advance yesterday was here near Natalyova, Russian forces advancing across this lake, across this windbreak here, seizing part of the far side of this lake. And we've talked about the fact that for Ukraine, there's not really anything to defend here in this peninsula. It's just kind of empty turf. And Russia's likely trying to occupy these two flanks and then sort of advance into here, right? Because Russia seems to prioritize square kilometers occupied, but Ukraine's sitting there and saying, listen, not all territories created equal, right? This is a farming hamlet with maybe less than a dozen buildings and empty fields. Ukraine's like, we're not going to sacrifice our valuable troops to defend an empty field. And so once Ukraine sits there and says, listen, we're here to defend the most important parts, and we're going to force Russia to come out of their defensive positions, to leave their trenches and go on the attack. And when they attack, we're going to hit them as hard as possible. And that has been the strategy across the front lines, right? You can see here near Otrodatina, where Russian forces have indeed continued to advance, but you notice what they're not doing. They're not occupying towns, right? When they do occupy towns like Arkhangelsk here, it's obvious that Ukrainian forces are fighting a controlled withdrawal, right, to behind these natural obstacles, right? This reservoir system, for example. Right? And you can see that Russian forces are, again, forced to cross big open fields where on their way to nothing, right? Here's a classic example right here. Note this advance here that Russian forces are pushing into an open field, but you can see this doesn't move them toward any discernible objective. And this is like classic. Imagine you're one of these Russian troops charging across an open field into Ukrainians, knowing that there's no strategic objective in front of you. So that's been the Ukrainian strategy, is to sit there and go, listen, we're trying not to put ourselves in situations where we have to fight these kind of rigid defenses, like a breakthrough situation. And instead, we want to create an environment where Russian forces are charging into nowhere and we mow them down, right? It's a simple attrition strategy, and it's very effective. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel. It does help. And thanks to the Colonel tier members and Lieutenant tier members at combatvetnews.com. Could not do this without you guys. See you in the next one. Cheers.